session on policy education. Good, I like that. Uh, about me, right? So Abhishek has already given an introduction. Policy is all I've done all my life. I mean, it's been a short life thus far. I've just turned 25. Been working for what, 4 years now, right? Couple of years at Twitter, a year in the parliament as a landfill, and a year as a consultant at Chase, right? And before that, the only education I have is in journalism. I went to Symbiosis Pune, and that's a BA in mass comm. That's it. That's the only degree I got. Have done, like, even in college, right? 6 semesters, did like 7 internships actually in 7 different cities and different focus areas of policy, and that really gave me a bearing of how do you get started here. Today, so for the past 3 years, I've been running a knowledge platform, Public Policy India. When the idea was, how do we get people to give a fuck about policy? If I can put it that way, right? How do we make policy more engaging and accessible for everyday Indians, right? And I'm also building out a policy school now, right? And I've also started a consulting firm of my own. So, few things which keep me busy during the day. And I'm open to, in fact, I think Abhishek has a list of questions already, which we'll get to shortly. But thank you again for joining, and very wonderful to be here.
Thanks a lot for that, Yash. I think, Yash, the first question that I think it's very, very important that we start with is, what is public policy for both a layperson's understanding and also for a law student?
Yeah. I mean, as Google would define it, right? Let me get that definition out of the way first, right? That public policy is a series of steps or regulations or whatever, right, that the government undertakes in order to solve a real world problem, a real world challenge, right? So there are potholes on the road in front of your house. Hopefully, at least, especially if you're from Bombay, the government, or Bangalore actually, the government will, put out a tender, right? Invite these road construction material companies or agents or contractors or whatever you, and they'll come and fix it and they'll get paid, right? So there's a policy in place, if you can look at it, right? That someone informs the government, they take cognizance of it, and then there's there's a tender design process. I mean, now it's all standard, but I'm saying at least when this was put through, right? And so that the government, the public's money is well used, at least on paper, right? And that you can minimize corruption, and there's competition in the bidding process, and that the job gets done, and the government itself doesn't have to do that, and all of it, right? Everything is public policy, from gender to healthcare to education to environment to nuclear energy, for all I care, right? Everything is public policy because everything is governed. There are laws for everything. Everything is being legislated upon. In fact, things for which there exist no laws, even their policy has a big impact. Looking at you, crypto, right? So I think the idea here is that as a policy professional, you're working in a job in a very broad sense, right? In which the idea is that you interact with the government as one of your stakeholders in some capacity, shape, or form, right? So it's like, it's something we'll get into, right, in the different kind of roles that there are in the policy space. But yes, when you work in public policy, you work in this broader ecosystem, right, which shapes the broader governance space in India, right? How policies are made, implemented, how business interact with it, how civil society interacts with it, the entire, range of stakeholders, right? And how it impacts them and how they impact this, right? A lot of people ask me that, what does policy mean for me, right? And I tell them in 4 words that it means prosperity for all Indians, right? Because at the end of the day, all policy choices and decisions that are made, they impact your day-to-day life. They impact your quality of life, right? They impact the way you live, where you live, how you live, and everything, right? And so that's public policy for you.
Thanks a lot for that, Yash. I think that's very, very insightful, and I really loved the 4-word explanation of what it is. But yeah, so I think moving on. So Yash, you've had very, very different roles in this space. I think, as you mentioned, you've also worked with different kinds of stakeholders through your journey in public policy so far. Yeah. Could you start by just giving us a little bit of an outline as to what exactly are some of those differences that you felt when you worked with these different stakeholders?
See, I think I'll take a step back, Abhishek, and try and focus on what the different stakeholders are in policy, right? How do they work and all of it. Same policy, you can work. So the government, of course, is a one major stakeholder, right? Because ultimately the state only the state has the power to make laws of the land, right, so to speak. So there's that. There's civil society, right, which works with a range of, again, different stakeholders, so that with their own set of agenda, right? Social equity, inclusion, and all of it, right? So there's, protecting democracy, free speech, civil rights. So there's civil society for you. there's non-profits, right? And they are again a critical stakeholder because they work a lot in policy implementation. Basically, these are the ones that work at the grassroots, right? And so that's where policy implementation comes in, and they have their own set of agendas and objectives and outcomes, right? That they look for. So that's NGOs, non-profits, what have you, right? Again, they work in the broader social impact, dev sector, as we call it, development sector, right? That's again under policy. There's private companies, right? Like I worked at Twitter, so and almost every private company, every company of consequence, right, will have a policy team. Why? Because businesses operate in an environment which is set up by the government, right? So it is the company's duty and mission to shape up the environment to their liking, right? At least to the extent that they can and it's feasible, right? So they are a stakeholder. Citizens, of course, are a stakeholder, and they do interact a lot with society and all, and sometimes they just interact directly as well. So then n number of ways, right, that you can get this. But broadly speaking, media is a stakeholder, by the way, right? Keeping the government in check, right? Keeping the citizens informed, right? And also and every other stakeholder informed as well, up to date that what's happening for a year, right? So there's a plethora of stakeholders there. Going back to specifically what you asked, Abhishek, like, see, you can work with all of these stakeholders in very different roles as well, right? But I think the idea here remains, at the end of the day, you're working on a core policy issue, right? It can be education, gender, healthcare, environment, whatever, right? And depending on the stakeholder you're working for, you're working from a different vantage point, right? So if you're working for a company, you might be looking to, shape the policies in a manner that doesn't harm your company too much, right? And if possible, then benefit it, but at least doesn't harm its operations too much, right? If you're working with the civil society, you want to work from the vantage point that the policies are designed, which loosely speaking, there are other objectives as well, but loosely speaking are fair, equal, not discriminate, and all of it, right? From the government's perspective, you want to do it in a manner that it touches as many citizens as possible and in a manner as impactful as possible, right? So because the government at the end of the day has to go back and win votes, right? At least in a democracy like ours. So yeah, different stakeholders there.
Thanks a lot for sharing that, Yash. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that the very interesting thing that you brought up is that there's different stakeholders and there's different ways that you can actually work with these different stakeholders, right? So I think that the one very important question, or rather a concern that a lot of people who are trying to try public policy for the first time, or like they're exploring their first public policy internship, is that which of these stakeholders should they choose and how should they go about it, right? Because it's a very overwhelming thing when you go and you're like, should I work with the government? Should I work with a company? Should I work with a center? What should I do, right? So do you have any guidance on how exactly one could go about that?
So 3-4 things, right? Number one, where do you want to work in, right? I'm sure all of us here have a particular leaning, at least some sense of it, right? I'm sure a lot of you would be like, you know what, I just want to work with non-profits, right? Some of you might be like, I just want to work on the ground at the grassroots with dev sector, NGOs, etc. Right? Some of you might be like, you might have a journalism background or media or whatever, and like, I want to work with the press, with the media, right? Keeping the government in check and making sure that the wheels are running smoothly, right? No foul play there. Some of you might be like, you love the corporate world, you love the corporate life, right? So you work with corporates and businesses, right? Some of you might be like, you know what, I want to work in policy design, right? So that's where the government, more or less the government is like the ultimate authority there, right? So you might want to work for the government itself. Some of you might be like, I love the whole policy ideation and research bit. So you might want to work with think tanks, right? So it depends on that, right? Some of you might be great at communication, so you can work in a policy communications role at any of these places, right? So it's in fact independent of the specific function concerned. So there's that. I think it depends a lot on where you want to work in that sense, right? Even if you don't have a specific organizational answer, at least you have some sense of values or I don't know, end goals, objectives for yourself, right? Or maybe where you think you might be a better fit, right? That is the most important thing. And apart from that, of course, there's this whole bit on skills, right? So getting in corporates is not easy at all, right? Getting into non-profits is relatively speaking easier, right? Getting to government, again, it's not about easy or difficult. It's about you need to be a very specific set of, let's just say, checklists, right? So it depends on, again, the set of skills you have as well, the experience you have, the credentials you have, and how all of that fits in as well, right? So one is that what you want, and number two is what you can get. If that makes sense.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And I think just building off and continuing on that. So I understand that you're not from a purely legal background, but I'm sure that you've worked with a lot of individuals who came from such a background.
Yeah.
And I think that what I really want to understand is that there is this, I think I would consider it a myth, that there is this myth that policy space as a space is something that, lawyers are supposed to be able to do really good in, or ideally
Yeah.
should be doing really good in. So,
Yeah.
I mean, even if we were to believe that for a moment, that maybe there is some kind of edge that they do have, what do you think would be that skill set, and how do you think that a law student can actually go ahead and, like, try to build that stronger and actually make a career in public policy?
See, the skills that policy needs, right, and the skills that law endows you with, a legal education gives you, are actually very similar. So that's a good thing. When I was in LAMP working in the parliament, more than half the cohort was lawyers, right? So having that bit of background in law, of course, helps. Like over the years, I've learned a lot of legalese myself, going beyond ratio and obiter, right? Because in some roles you do need it, not in all of them, right? That's one thing. But having said that, the core skills that are needed are the same, right? Lawyer or not. So soft skills, right? How do you communicate? How do you manage stakeholders? How do you write an email? How do you manage your time, right? How do you speak? How well, do you speak with people? Are you a people's person, right? This is a people's business at the end of the day, right? We are not the people who build websites. We're not the people who do coding. We are the people who are in the people's business, right? Getting together with folks and solving complex policy challenges in whatever shape and form and capacity that we can, right? So soft skills, the most critical. Apart from that, the whole hard skills bit, honestly, it's easier to learn. Like, if you need to learn website development, you can. It's not difficult. If you need to learn graphic design, it's easy. I did all of that, for the platform that I run myself. And so, because hard skills are like a switch, either you know them or you don't. Soft skills are like a knob, right? So you lay somewhere on the lay mark. So I would say that the core skills remain the soft skills, right? And lawyer or not, otherwise it's a very similar scenario for everyone who's wishing to get here. Yeah.
Fair enough. Thanks for sharing that, Yash. And Yash, I think, again, just as a follow up to that, for, let's say, a law student, or rather for any student for that matter, when we think about opportunities in the public policy space, when we're still in college and we're pursuing an undergraduate degree, which is, let's say, not in a direct domain of public policy, what are some of the opportunities that, just from the top of your head, you think are things that people should try to look out for? Like, of course, there is the platform PPI that people can follow to just keep track of these things, but what are some of the other things that you would recommend that people can do to just be in touch with the space?
I mean, I'm assuming, Abhishek, when you say be in touch with this space, you mean the job opportunities there, right? Or is it something else?
Both in terms of tracking opportunities and also going ahead and trying to, like, involve yourself in the space, keep in touch with what's going on.
Right. I mean, shameless self-plug, but the newsletter that I send out every week, right? I mean, there we include not just the jobs and internships and courses and stuff you should read and stuff you should watch, all specific to the world of policy, but also places you can volunteer and all. So if you want, you can check that out. But coming back to the question you asked, Abhishek, the idea is that, for jobs, I would say, honestly, there's not that a single portal that lists out all policy jobs. It's impossible. There are a lot of them, right? But like, say, there's a site called Dev Sector Info, which is good for social impact jobs, right? LinkedIn is great for all the corporate policy jobs for sure. You'll find it there, right? What we try and do in the newsletter that I send is that we accumulate all of these, right? There's a portal for jobs at the UN and all as well. I'm forgetting the name. You can look that up. In terms of keeping in touch with policy, honestly, you just need to read more, right? The idea here is that you should be able to have a conversation for 15 minutes with anyone on any subject, right? Be it gender, or healthcare, education, environment, or any of the 100 other things that policy is or comprises of, right? Just so throughout your career, depth, yes, but breadth as well, right? I keep telling people that to work in policy, you need to be a jack of all trades and master of some, right? I think that's the idea. So you need to know about spaces that you don't work in as well, so that you can do 2 + 2 together, right? Because there's no clear delineation these days, right? And please try and understand, even if you work in education, right? The thing is, education is also going online, digital, so there's elements of tech policy within education as well, for example, right? Just an example. So there's no one thing that, you can be like, what, I'm going to work in a research role in education all my life. That's never going to happen. I'm sorry, right? You'll need to know about different fields, at least basics, what's happening, how they're working, be in touch with, not news, but see, there's a difference between information and knowledge, right? Information is something which goes stale the next day. So newspaper is information, but the op-ed pages inside the newspaper is knowledge. So knowledge is something that stands the test of time. books are generally knowledge, right? So you have to make that call for yourself, but gain as much knowledge as you can. So you have some fundamental principles and building blocks that, at least intellectually, that okay, these are how these things work. This is how this space has shaped up. This is how it might impact whichever area I'm working in. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So moving to the last section for tonight's call, I would actually now move to just throw certain myths about the public policy space or about the policy space at large, and you can just come in and share your opinion on all of them. So I think the first and I think the most heard of one is that the public policy space doesn't pay you as much, but it's probably just the same kind of work that you're doing in any other job where you're going to probably be earning a little more. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's true about certain sections of the policy space. So if you work in dev sector, you won't get paid much. If you work in the whole social impact space, generally you won't get paid much. Okay, this is not a sweeping statement. This is not meant to be a sweeping statement, by the way. There are exceptions everywhere, but generally, if you work in corporate policy, yes, of course, you get paid like thrice or 4 times of what a dev sector person usually does. If you work with the government, again, you don't get paid much at all. Yeah, so it depends on where within policy you're working, right? If you're working with a think tank and all, you get paid decently, right? If you work with one of the larger orgs working in the broader social impact space, like Central Square Foundation in Education, for example, right? You get paid very well, right? So even within that, there are exceptions and norms these days, but there's the thing: a lot of people who come to policy also come with the whole, the idea that they're in it for the impact and not just for the, the money and the career. It's a notion I disagree with, in the sense, I think at the end of the day, everyone has a family to run and food to put on the plate. So there's that, but that's how the landscape is currently. Is all I'm trying to say.
Okay, and I think the next myth would essentially be, I think this is not necessarily about pursuing a degree like a master's in public policy, but what I want to understand is that, do you agree or disagree with the view that you always need some kind of specialized education or some kind of specialized degree or some kind of something specialized in public policy before you actually get into a career in public policy?
I don't have any degree. Definitely not in policy. The head of public policy for WhatsApp in India, for Snapchat in India, for Deutsche Bank, a lot of these large places, they don't have either. These are people I know, they have a simple B in sociology or something. Point being, this is a place which cares a lot about the work you've done, right? And about your proof of work more than your proof of education, right? It really does not care too much about the degree you have. Again, the exception. So if you want to work in a very pure research academic role, you will need a PhD, I'm assuming, and that's that. But for a vast majority, 99% of the other jobs, it's fine if you don't have a master's, at least to an extent, right? To a large extent, actually, right? It's fine as long as you have the work credentials to show, right? See, this is a very new and up and coming space. Okay, people just care about the work you've done and what you've learned there, right? They know that a degree really can't teach you a lot of these soft skills that the policy job needs, anyways, right? I don't want to name names, but I was in a policy school recently, and I met students who were in their final semester, and they were being taught geopolitics of Sudan, and I'm like, how is this going to help them land jobs in India in policy? So, anyways, the degree does not teach you skills that are actually needed to do a policy job. Okay, so do keep that in mind.
Yeah, sounds fair. And I think my next question, which is I think something that you've already answered somewhat by explaining that policy is something which is very intertwined with literally anything and everything that we do. But I think there's always this myth that there's certain jobs or there are certain profiles or roles that you can get yourself into that are more transferable in terms of your work experience or your knowledge and skill sets as opposed to others. Do you think that getting into any kind of role in policy makes it less transferable or more transferable to, let's say, get into, like, let's say, a corporate career or a core career in something very, very different at a later point of time?
No, not at all. In fact, this does not make sense at all for the policy space. And I'll tell you why. See, the core skills remain the same, Abhishek, right? No matter where you're working. You'll have to manage stakeholders. You'll have to be a good people's person. You'll have to be a phenomenal communicator. You need to be very good with your emails. Like, you need to be very good at managing time. You need to have that basic sense of what's happening in the space. You need to have that basic understanding of how the government is structured. So does a joint secretary come above a secretary? Does an undersecretary come above a joint secretary? Whatever, right? How that is structured, right? So that base level knowledge you'll need to have. So these skills will remain the same no matter where you're working. apart from that, on top of this, there'll be other skills. So you're working policy comms, then you'll need to have knowledge of social media. If you're working at the think tank, you'll need to have knowledge of research methodologies. If you're working at at a social impact space, you need to have knowledge of how does survey and evaluation work, right? So the core, say 5 or 6 core skills remain the same. On top of that, you can add a couple depending on where you're working. I hope that framework makes sense.
Yep. All right, perfect. So that's actually all the myths that I had. But I'm going to leave it open to you if you might want to share any myths that along your journey you've picked up on, if you've heard, and you would want to bust them out.
No myth. Maybe I'll just add one thing before we close this or take questions or whatever, that the space is really on the cusp of a boom, right? The number of universities, the number of people working in this space, the number of jobs is more than doubling by a few months. And I myself stay in Delhi just for 15 days a month because I'm just traveling otherwise to different cities in this country to see just how wonderfully and the sense of energy and enthusiasm with this space is coming up. So there's never been a better time to be in policy, right? In whichever role and capacity and form that you want to be. But yeah, policy needs everyone, from a chemist to a chartered accountant, right? All sorts of backgrounds. So make the most of it.
All right. Thanks a lot for sharing that, Yash. And thanks a lot for joining us tonight for this wonderful session. That brings me to the end of my questions for tonight. So thanks once again on behalf of Team Plant. And but yeah,